Once again, and welcome back to New Day. It's time for our social segment, and today we are talking about the ever increasing challenge of accommodation in Ghana, which has now become a national headache. To delve into this issue, I have with me this morning Mr. Osei Kwame Ajimai, who is the past president of the Ghana Institute of Architects. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
It's good to have you here this morning.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about our ever-increasing challenge with accommodation in this country. What is the present situation with housing in Ghana?
Wow, the figures keep changing, and obviously it depends on how you look at it in terms of other units. And I guess it's been said over and over that we have a housing deficit of approximately 1.7 million units. So basically, in terms of just the physical facility, probably say that's what a deficit is. But there are several other factors that go to determine how far we move from there. A lot has been said about housing, which normally refers to the physical facility. I prefer to talk about shelter and settlements because housing is just a part of people's daily endeavor. Everybody needs a safe place to sleep and carry out their daily needs. And beyond that, they have enterprises that they do, and they move from place to place. So housing is just one of the basic needs of the several things that happen on a daily basis. So to deal with housing, you also need to look at all the other factors that pertain to people's daily behavior and activities.
What are some of these factors that we're talking about?
Everyone in the city or everyone in the nation, especially adults, have some entrepreneurial objectives, which is basically that you must earn some income to be able to look after yourself. So housing only satisfies your accommodation or your sleeping needs, as it were. So you cannot, for example, go and put houses in Ada and expect that people who work in Accra would go and live there. There's a relationship. And if you did that, then it means that you must provide them with some high-speed transportation to get to Accra, to their workplace. So there is some relationship, and it's partially that which has created some of the problems for us. Because if you take Accomodation, for example, which has a population, I believe, of well over 80,000 people, it's only because a lot of them commute not more than probably 30 minutes to get to their workplaces. So if you want to tackle housing, you need to look at what is the reason why people are being housed, and what is the total concept in which you want to look at housing and settlements. Yeah.
How can we overcome this housing challenge?
You need to take a very broad look at it. I mean, housing, where people stay, must be related to where they work and what are their daily needs. Okay, so those who have access to means of movement are better placed, especially their own means of movement are better placed. First of all, you need to look at land utilization, whether it is still in the national interest to be offering people 900 square meters for what you would call a plot to build a single house on it, or it is worth looking at mass housing where you have a lot more people per area, and the relationships between what people do in these houses and what kind of facilities you can provide for them so that we don't move too far out of places. I think the critical thing is also to realize that everyone is entitled to safe and decent accommodation. The tendency that everyone must own a house must be disregarded. Once you can have access to accommodation where you're secure over a certain period.
So you're saying not everyone must own a house. We should not aspire to own our own homes.
Nowhere in the world does the whole population own houses, because it's not everybody who can afford to own a house. But people can afford to stay in decent...
But is it not an African thing or a black thing for you to want to own your home?
It may be so, but is it logical? Does it inure to the whole of the population that everybody must own a facility,
So
such
what
that
should we be doing? What are you advocating instead?
we should provide houses, and those who can own must own. Those who are capable of renting must rent. Those who can't rent must be assisted to have some decent shelter. Also must look at traditionally what is considered a home. I mean, a lot of people who lived in compound homes did a lot of communal things. And I'm inclined to believe that in a lot of the, low-class areas, people live off the streets. In other words, they don't cook in their homes. They don't bath in their homes. They don't entertain in their homes. They don't recreate in their homes. But they do all this in the community. You need to look at housing also from that perspective, okay? Because for a certain class of people, it is more affordable to just rent a one-room facility. And I've experienced this in Lumbushi with a couple of people that I work with there. All they want is a place to sleep. And then you need to consider all their other health, catering, religious, entertainment needs within the community. Because when you want to give them what we've been talking about, which is a 2 or 3 bedroom house, it becomes unaffordable.
Okay, let me take you back a bit. You just mentioned about people not aspiring to own their homes, that people should look more towards maybe renting and all of that. Let's talk about look up the astronomical prices of rent in this country. Is it advisable to rent as opposed to trying to own your own home, be it whether via mortgage or any other means?
You know, I guess in Europe a lot of people rent. I mean,
Yes, but they don't pay 1 year, 2 years rent advance
right.
like we do over
That is
here.
right, because we have a supply problem, okay, and don't forget that you can't spend all your income on housing. There's a certain proportion of it that you should be able to spend on housing. So for everyone who earns an income, whether it's 100 cedis a day or is it 2,000 cedis a day, there's a certain proportion that you ought to spend on housing. For those in the lower brackets, it's a certain small sum, and they're able to make payments monthly. You follow me? So with that, they're comfortable. You need to aggregate that sum over 10 years to be able to get a house. So while they don't have that aggregate sum to own a house, they still have some income which they can rent.
Put it towards.
And once you make, it's also a design and planning situation where you can make things affordable for people to do. While certain people may want to shop monthly because they are able to store and freeze and keep, others shop weekly or daily. You need to translate this concept into housing as well. That some people wake up in the morning, whatever endeavor they do, at the close of the day, there's a certain proportion that they can use towards their accommodation. To accumulate it becomes a problem for them. And they're probably in the class where they don't have access to credit to help them accumulate that amount of money to build.
So this money that I'm still back on the rent issue. You're saying that we should put every month towards rent. Wouldn't it be safer or more prudent to put it towards a mortgage so that at the end of the day you can own your home?
Mortgage doesn't come cheap. The market itself, has its own problems. With the deficit we have, it's quite a challenge, because you need finance. I mean, at the statistics that we are putting out, 2 people per room, and trying to cater for 1.7 million units, the amount of land, the amount of finance, the amount of infrastructure that you need to put into all this is quite a huge task.
And I'm even told only about 15% of the population can access mortgages. How true is that?
Because you need to qualify to be able to access the mortgage. The guy who pushes a truck at Mokolo, the guy who sells oranges on the street, who all need accommodation, the 24 point something million people can all need accommodation. It has nothing to do with your status. Okay? It is a right which is part of the national housing policy that people are entitled to decent accommodation. Okay? We tend to look at the top end of the structure, but are very vulnerable people who all need accommodation. Just like when we see people need water, it doesn't matter whether you are a food seller, a food vendor, or you're a businessman. Okay? So you need to consider the fact that there are vulnerable people in the system who can't necessarily afford what the system provides. Therefore, there must always be some amount of state intervention to do that.
Some people have also blamed the real estate developers for the housing problems in this country, in the sense that they believe that they cater only for the upper class, leaving the other people to their own fates. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess every entrepreneur goes into business with objectives. And if they find it viable that if I want to put in so much investment, what's my return? It's a basic principle in business. And I'm not too sure whether they think returns on social housing is worth it. And that is why sometimes it becomes, government's objective or government's intention to try and cater for the vulnerable group. Exactly. Unfortunately, almost all the housing we do, is for public servants or public workers of the government and not necessarily for the vulnerable group. So and even the real estate developers have challenges themselves, access to credit, infrastructure development. Now there's VAT on the buildings that you put out, okay? And so,
but is it true that they're only catering to a certain market?
Well,
is that right?
From a business perspective, it's perfectly right. From a social perspective, there may be challenges.
So who should cater to the average income earners?
Well, the state must find a way to enable people to cater for
What about
them.
private sector participation? Must we leave everything to government?
No. I said the state must enable private people to find it worth it investing for the lower end. For example, if the land is a part of the cost of any house. Infrastructure is a cost. Access to credit. If you'll provide low-end people credit to be able to access these things, and you can put in the land and the infrastructure, it makes it more, possible for the real estate to cater for the lower end. I mean, there are ways by which you can do all this. There's some amount of sacrifices. There's also what we call cross financing, where you can make sure that you earn or you take some taxes from the high end and make sure that you can use these to provide for the low end.
What about issues of land acquisition, prolonged land title registration, and all of that? How do they all come into play with the housing challenge in the country?
There are institutional challenges with land administration and even the regulatory systems for housing development. The state has its own challenges, which they are trying to address with the National Housing Policy and the land use planning policy as well. But it is a challenge, definitely, and we need to see how best. Right now we're going to the point where the citizenry are not too confident that institutions can resolve their issues, which is a dangerous situation, because to have a bit of law and order in the system, you need to be able to, as well, have confidence in those institutions. And development, I must say, is running way ahead of the capacity of the regulatory bodies to do what they have to do, which is also dangerous. And I'm sure you're aware of all the disasters that happen in the system, people staying in flood-prone areas and the markets going, the fire situations in the market. And it's only because...
Is there a relationship between good or proper accommodation and health? Or sanitation, for example, we talked about Abublushi, for instance, and now you're talking about the fires and other things.
There is. Unfortunately, we don't seem to recognize that our health cost, the health, how much it costs the government to cure some of the health issues that arise out of poor accommodation. I mean, an ambient environment, when I say ambient, sufficient air, sufficient lighting, sanitation, good grounds,
ventilation.
Good areas of ventilation, your surroundings, your gutters are not breeding mosquitoes and all that. All those who suffer from mosquitoes because they do not have, all those who suffer from, health-related issues because they do not have good accommodation. At the end of the day, that bill is borne by the state. It will be good, therefore, for the state to recognize that an environment that has the proper sanitation requirements and buildings that have... Recently, I just took a look at some of the classrooms that they've converted the windows to what we call aeration blocks. The children will grow up with poor eyesight and visibility. And, so you need to look at what is appropriate and what is comfortable for people to live in terms of the housing that you provide them. So definitely there is a relationship between the house, the settlement within their inn, and their health conditions.
Now, the Honourable Minister, Collins Dowda, stated recently that a minimum of about 170,000 units would have to be built annually over a 10-year period for us to bridge that gap in the deficiency. How realistic do you think this is?
That is a very tough order. I don't think Greta are doing more than 1,000 units a year. That's a well-organized setup.
And he's saying 170,000.
That's tough. Now, what do you mean by units? You know, are units houses or are units accommodation units? Are we looking at 2-3 bedroom bungalows like you have in the Reggie Manuels and the Manets? Or are we looking at, apartment blocks, Because, like I said,
which would be feasible?
Both are feasible, depending on what class you're trying to cater for. Both are feasible. But we should consider that, the way